The roar of the motorcycles echoed through the small, quiet town, shattering the evening peace as the pack of bikers rolled into the parking lot of the rundown dive bar. It was just after sunset, the sky painted in a mix of purples and oranges, but the air was thick with tension as the group dismounted their bikes, each man more imposing than the last. The bar, an old building with flickering neon lights that spelled tavern, had seen its fair share of rough nights, but tonight felt different. Inside, Ben Lawson sat at the far end of the bar, his elbows resting on the counter as he took a long drag from his drink. He wasn't in a rush. He never was. He'd been on the road for most of his life, crisscrossing the country as a trucker, stopping only when the miles started to weigh heavy on him. The life suited him. Quiet, alone, with just the hum of the road to keep him company. Tonight, he was simply passing through. A stop at the bar, a few hours of peace, then back to the highway. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. He hadn't noticed the bikers walk in, but the sudden increase in noise did catch his attention. The laughter, the insults, the sharp clinking of bottles, they weren't exactly subtle. Ben didn't turn around immediately. He didn't have to. He could already hear the way they moved, the way they carried themselves. Loud, aggressive, looking for a place to stir up trouble. It was the same wherever he went. These guys were trouble, and they were about to make a mess. "Look at this old man," one of the bikers jeered loudly, his voice cutting through the chatter. "What's he doing here? Probably didn't even know there was a bar in town." The group of bikers erupted into raucous laughter, their eyes scanning the room, looking for their next target. Ben took another slow sip from his glass. He wasn't the kind of man who started fights, but he wasn't the kind of man who would back down either. The biker who had spoken was getting closer now, a sneer on his face, clearly looking to provoke him. Ben didn't move, didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched but his expression unreadable. The biker, frustrated by the lack of response, walked right up to Ben. "What, are you too old to talk, Grandpa?" he said, his breath smelling of cheap whiskey. "Or are you just too scared to speak?" Ben set his glass down carefully, the sound of the glass meeting the bar surface like a faint echo in the otherwise tense room. He finally turned his head slowly to face the biker, his eyes calm, level, and full of something the man wasn't expecting. There was no anger there, no fear, just a deep, knowing quiet. "I'm not scared of anything, kid," Ben said, his voice low but firm. "But I don't need to waste my time with people who don't know how to respect others." The biker paused for a moment, taken aback by the calmness in Ben's voice. It wasn't the kind of reaction he'd been expecting. He had been looking for a reaction, something, anything, to justify the anger he was carrying. But Ben was an enigma, the kind of guy who didn't flinch, the kind of guy who wasn't intimidated by a few drunk idiots. "Well, ain't you a tough guy?" the biker said with a sharp laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's see how tough you are when we start having a little fun with you." The group of bikers behind him chuckled, their eyes narrowing as they closed in, the space between them and Ben shrinking. They could sense the tension now, the unspoken challenge hanging in the air. The bar grew quieter, the regulars turning their heads, watching with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. This wasn't just a bunch of guys messing with an old man. This was something else, something about the stillness of the man, something about the calm in his eyes that made the bikers second-guess their decision to pick a fight. Ben didn't flinch, didn't stand up. He simply leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting easily on the arms, his posture relaxed. There was something in his presence that commanded attention now, something that made the bikers hesitate just for a moment. The leader of the pack, a large man with a thick beard and a leather jacket adorned with patches, walked forward, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "You think you can sit there and talk to me like that? Like you're some kind of big shot?" Ben's lips barely moved as he spoke. "I'm not here to prove anything, and I don't have anything to prove to you." The biker was about to say something else, but then something shifted. Maybe it was the way Ben spoke, his steady gaze that seemed to pierce through the bravado. Or maybe it was the sheer weight of the quiet in the room that began to settle in the minds of the bikers. Whatever it was, the group paused, their laughter dying down, their confidence suddenly slipping. Ben took a deep breath, the calmness of his movements only adding to the growing unease in the bikers. There was no rage in his voice, no threat of violence, just an overwhelming sense of control. He wasn't scared, he wasn't even angry. He was simply indifferent, and it was the indifference that unsettled the bikers the most. For a long moment, it felt like time had frozen in place. The bikers stood in front of him, unsure of what to do next. They had expected to bully him, to make him react, but Ben wasn't reacting, and that, more than anything, was what made them start to feel like they had made a huge mistake. One of the bikers, Jake, a younger member of the group, took a hesitant step back, his bravado slipping further. He glanced at his leader, then back at Ben, unsure of what to make of the situation. Rico, the leader, caught his eye and scowled. He wasn't used to backing down, not like this. He didn't know it yet, but it was too late to walk away. Ben sat up slowly, his shoulders straightening, and in that small movement, everything shifted. He wasn't just an old man anymore. He wasn't just a trucker who had wandered into the wrong bar. The room seemed to breathe in with him, the stillness taking on a new weight, like a storm about to break. Rico's hand twitched near his belt, but he didn't move. Not yet. "Take your boys and leave," Ben said, his voice calm and authoritative, "before I show you why you picked the wrong guy to mess with." The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of Ben's words settling over the group of bikers like a cloud that had suddenly turned dark. Rico's eyes flickered with confusion, a brief crack in his mask of arrogance. He wasn't used to this kind of calm. Most people would have blustered, tried to defend themselves, or shrunk back in fear. But Ben wasn't doing any of that. For a moment, the gang stood still, uncertain. The bar was unnervingly quiet, the patrons watching from the corners of their eyes. A few whispered to each other, their voices hushed, knowing that something wasn't right. The bikers had come in here looking to have some fun, to pick on an easy target, but Ben wasn't the kind of man who fit into their idea of a victim. Rico, still trying to salvage the situation, stepped closer to Ben. "You think you can just tell us what to do?" he spat, his voice thick with the sourness of alcohol. "We came here to have a good time, and now you're making it weird. You gonna make us leave, old man?" Ben didn't flinch, didn't even blink. His gaze remained fixed on Rico, but there was something more to it now, something deeper. He could feel the tension in the air, the beat of the clock ticking in the back of his mind, but he wasn't bothered by it. He had been in worse situations. He had faced down real enemies, real danger, not just loudmouth punks who thought they owned the world. "Listen carefully, Rico," Ben said quietly, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "I don't care what you came here to do. I'm not interested in your games, your noise, or your disrespect. But if you make the wrong move, if you push this any further, I'll show you just how wrong you are." Rico's smirk wavered. He wasn't sure if Ben was bluffing or not, but the words hit harder than he expected. His mind raced for a response, for some way to salvage his pride, but it wasn't coming. The realization, the quiet understanding, started to sink in. The guy in front of him wasn't just some old trucker who had stumbled into the wrong place. He was a man who had lived through things Rico couldn't even begin to imagine. One of the other bikers, Jake, the youngest of the group, took a step back. His bravado was starting to crumble as he watched Ben's unwavering calm. The others in the gang seemed to feel it too, the shift in the air, the change in the power dynamic. What was supposed to be a quick, easy intimidation had turned into something they weren't prepared for. "Maybe we should go," Jake muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "This isn't worth it." But Rico wasn't done yet. He wasn't the kind of man to back down, even when he could feel the pressure mounting. "No," he growled, his voice thick with anger and pride. "I'm not gonna let this old man talk to me like that. He needs to learn his place." He turned back to Ben, puffing out his chest as if to assert his dominance. "You don't get to tell me what to do. You think you're some kind of badass, huh? You think I'm scared of you?" Ben didn't move, didn't flinch. His eyes never left Rico's, steady, unblinking, like a predator watching its prey. "I don't care if you're scared or not," Ben said, "but you're about to find out what happens when you push the wrong person." Rico took another step forward, his hands clenched into fists now, his face twisted with rage. But as he moved, Ben's hand shifted ever so slightly, the motion subtle but deliberate. It was the kind of movement that only someone who had been trained to react in a split second could make. In an instant, Ben's hand was on Rico's wrist, twisting it with precise force. Rico let out a sharp gasp of pain, his body jerking back as Ben's grip tightened, locking his wrist in place. The bar fell into stunned silence, the patrons watching in disbelief. Ben wasn't just talking. He wasn't backing down. He was showing them exactly what kind of man they had underestimated. Rico tried to jerk away, but it was too late. Ben was faster. With a swift motion, Ben moved behind him, pushing him forward so that Rico's chest slammed into the bar. The air rushed from his lungs, the force of it making him dizzy. His gang was frozen now, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to react. They had come here to cause trouble, but this was something else entirely. Ben stood over Rico, his voice still calm, but carrying the weight of a man who had been through far worse. "I don't want to fight you, Rico," Ben said, his words almost soft. "But if you keep pushing, I'll finish this for good." Rico's eyes widened in shock. He couldn't believe what was happening. This wasn't the way he had imagined it. He had been ready to throw hands, to teach this old man a lesson, but now, with his wrist locked in Ben's grip, his entire world felt out of control. He tried to struggle, tried to break free, but Ben's hold was unyielding. You think you're tough?" Rico spat, his voice shaky. "You think you can just walk all over us?" Ben's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening just enough to send a jolt of pain through Rico's body. "I'm not walking all over you. I'm giving you a chance to walk away," he said, his voice low but full of authority. "You've already lost this fight, Rico. You just don't know it yet." Rico's face was pale now, his body trembling with the effort to break free. The gang, once so full of bravado, stood there in stunned silence, watching their leader struggle. They had underestimated the quiet man at the bar, and now they were paying the price. "I said it before," Ben continued, his voice unwavering. "You need to walk away, and if you don't, you'll learn the hard way that you picked the wrong guy." Rico's head spun, and for a moment, he considered making another move, trying to swing at Ben, trying to regain some semblance of control. But then he saw it, the steady, unwavering calm in Ben's eyes. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even hatred, it was something deeper, something that told him there would be no winning this fight. No matter how many of them there were, no matter how loud they got, they couldn't beat a man who had already seen it all. "I'm done," Rico muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He glanced at his gang, the humiliation clear on his face. His pride was shattered, but his body still wouldn't move. He had lost. And deep down, he knew it. Slowly, Ben released his grip on Rico's wrist, the biker slumping forward, trying to catch his breath. The room stayed silent for a long moment. No one dared to move. "Get out," Ben said, his voice quiet but final. Rico, humiliated and beaten, gestured for the rest of the gang to follow. One by one, they trudged out of the bar, their heads down, their pride broken. They didn't say a word as they left, and the only sound that followed them was the heavy thud of their boots as they disappeared into the night. The bar remained silent for a moment longer before the regulars, who had been holding their breath, slowly began to murmur among themselves. Ben didn't move, didn't acknowledge them. He simply sat back down at the bar, his drink waiting for him. He wasn't looking for recognition. He wasn't looking for trouble. He had just done what needed to be done. The rest of the night was his. As the bartender slid a fresh drink in front of him, he gave a slight nod, acknowledging the end of the brief storm that had passed through his life tonight. Quiet, calm, the way he liked it. The door swung shut behind the bikers with a sharp clink, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Ben didn't watch them leave. He wasn't interested in their retreat. He was more focused on the stillness that followed, how the bar seemed to breathe again, how the weight of tension lifted. The other patrons had started talking in hushed tones, but no one was eager to approach him. Not yet. The regulars, the ones who had been watching with wide eyes, were still unsure whether they had witnessed a fight or a miracle. Ben sat in his chair for a moment, the weight of the room pressing down on him. He wasn't bothered by the stares. He wasn't bothered by anything, really. That was the thing. People never expected that kind of calm, that unshakable quiet from someone like him. They saw an old man, a trucker who probably spent most of his days in isolation, with nothing but the road for company. They never guessed that he wasn't just anyone. They never saw the quiet strength in him, the years of training, the kind of focus that came with a past that most people couldn't even imagine. He lifted his glass, finishing the last of his drink, the burn of the whiskey barely registering on his tongue anymore. The noise in the bar had returned to normal now. The usual chatter, the clink of glasses, the hum of conversation. It was like nothing had ever happened, but for Ben, it was different. He wasn't the man he had been when he walked in. He never would be again. As the bartender wiped down the counter, he glanced over at Ben, his expression thoughtful. "You know, you could have really hurt those guys," he said, his voice low, like he wasn't sure if he should even be acknowledging what had happened. Ben didn't look at him. He knew the bartender wasn't looking for a detailed response. He was just processing, trying to figure out how to deal with the mess that had unfolded in front of him. "I didn't want to," Ben replied simply, his voice steady. "But they didn't leave me much choice." The bartender nodded, his eyes flicking toward the door where the bikers had exited. "You handled yourself pretty damn well. They were all talk, but they were huge. Figured there might have been a fight." Ben turned his gaze toward the door too, but his mind was elsewhere. The bar was calm again, but he could still feel the flicker of adrenaline in his chest, that tension, that feeling of being on edge. He knew he couldn't walk away from it completely. It was in his blood now, that readiness, that awareness of what it felt like to be in control and to let it go at the same time. "Sometimes it's better to show them what you're capable of without going too far," Ben said, more to himself than to the bartender. The bartender didn't say anything for a moment, just watched him. He wasn't a young man, but Ben knew that the bartender had seen his fair share of rowdy drunks and tough guys in his time. He had probably witnessed his share of brawls and skirmishes, but he had never seen someone handle things the way Ben had. No rage, no excessive force, just calm, quiet control. Ben had just put them in their place, and they had learned something in the process. "Yeah, I guess you're right," the bartender muttered, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I don't think they'll be back anytime soon. Not after that." Ben simply nodded, still not looking at him. He could hear the murmur of conversation picking up again. The tension had passed, but it would linger in the air for a while. People in this town weren't used to seeing this kind of thing. Someone standing their ground without a fight, without even raising their voice. But that's how it had always been for Ben. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about keeping the peace, knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, knowing when to act and when to let things go. The bar bell rang as the door opened again, this time quieter than before. A figure stepped in, and Ben didn't need to look to know who it was. The woman who had been serving drinks all night, Maggie, walked in, her eyes searching the room and then landing on Ben. She was the kind of woman who carried herself with authority, who had seen enough to understand when things were about to go south. She approached him, her heels clicking softly on the floor, but she wasn't rushing. When she reached the counter, she gave him a small nod. "You all right?" Her tone was steady, the concern in her eyes barely hidden beneath the casual mask of professionalism. "I'm fine," Ben said, his voice quieter now, a little more tired. "Just had to set some things straight." Maggie studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp. "You didn't have to do that," she said, "but I think they got the message." Ben didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what he was feeling, whether it was satisfaction or just exhaustion from the whole thing. But he knew this much: he had made the right choice. He had been pushed too far, but he hadn't been the one to start it. Sometimes you had to show people that there were lines they couldn't cross, and sometimes it wasn't about proving how tough you were. It was about showing them you didn't have to prove anything at all. "I know," Ben finally said, meeting her gaze. "I'm just tired of the noise." Maggie gave him a small smile, one that spoke volumes more than her words. "Well, I'd say you've earned a night of peace, don't you think?" Ben returned her smile, just a slight curve of the lips. He wasn't used to receiving recognition, especially not for something like this, but there was something about her quiet acknowledgement that made the tension in his body start to fade. Maybe, just for tonight, things could go back to normal. The sound of the door opening again broke the moment. 2 more regulars entered, and the bar's energy shifted once more. Ben could feel the weight of their gazes, but he didn't care. The bikers were gone, the night was his, and he had nothing left to prove. He took a deep breath, standing slowly. "I'll be heading out soon," he said, his voice calm, a steady undercurrent of satisfaction in it now. "I've got a long drive ahead." Maggie nodded, giving him a final glance. "Safe travels, Ben," she said softly. "And thanks for handling things the way you did." Ben gave her a final nod, then turned and walked out of the bar into the cool night air. The world seemed quieter now. The hum of the town faded into the background, and for the first time in a long while, Ben felt like he had done exactly what he had set out to do. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because it was right. And that was all that mattered. The night air felt cooler as Ben walked to his truck, the gravel under his boots crunching with each step. He didn't hurry. There was no need to. The adrenaline from the confrontation had already faded, leaving behind a quiet sense of resolution. The bikers were gone, the bar was settling back into its usual rhythm, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Ben was able to breathe without the weight of the world pressing in on him. He reached the truck, the old engine starting with a low rumble as he slid into the driver's seat. The dashboard lights flickered to life, casting a soft glow across his weathered face. He sat there for a moment, hands resting on the wheel, staring out at the street ahead. The town was still, save for a few late-night cars rolling by. The air smelled faintly of pine and dust, the quiet of the night almost comforting. Ben wasn't sure what had brought him to this particular bar on this particular night. He hadn't planned for any of it, but then again, things never really went the way he planned. The road had always been unpredictable, and no matter how many miles he'd put behind him, it always felt like it was leading him to some place where he had to prove something. He thought he had left that behind, fighting, conflict, the need to show the world what he was made of. But there was something about this town, something about tonight that had called to him. He shifted the truck into gear, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust as he slowly pulled out of the lot and onto the empty road. The headlights cut through the darkness ahead, but Ben didn't rush. He wasn't going anywhere fast, not tonight. As he drove, his mind wandered back to the bikers. He hadn't been looking for a fight, but he knew when it was time to stand his ground. They had tested him, but in the end, it wasn't about proving he was stronger or tougher. It was about showing them that the quietest man in the room was the one who had control. The ones who were loud, the ones who pushed, they were the ones who were weak. And Ben knew weakness when he saw it. It wasn't their size, or their tattoos, or the roaring motorcycles. It was their desperation to be seen, to be acknowledged. That's what made them dangerous. Ben wasn't like that. He didn't need the world's attention. He never had. He had seen too much, been through too many battles to care about who noticed him now. The headlights from another car blinked into his rearview mirror, briefly illuminating the cab before fading back into the night. Ben didn't even flinch. He just kept driving, his fingers lightly gripping the wheel as the road stretched out in front of him, endless and unyielding. But just as he was about to let his thoughts wander again, a light flickered in the distance, and he saw the familiar figure of a motorcycle pulling up behind him. At first, he thought nothing of it, another traveler, another biker out on the road. But as the motorcycle drew closer, Ben felt a tightness in his chest. The light from the bike grew brighter, closer, too close. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, seeing the silhouette of a man on the bike, the glint of chrome reflecting the headlights. He wasn't just passing by, the bike was following him. Ben's grip tightened on the wheel, his instincts kicked in, the old habits that had never quite gone away. He wasn't worried, not yet, but he knew what this was. It was the same feeling he'd gotten when the bikers had first walked into the bar, when someone picked a fight because they thought they could. The bike stayed with him for miles, the engine's growl growing louder with each passing minute. Ben didn't look back, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him react. He knew what they were doing. They were trying to scare him, to intimidate him. They wanted him to flinch, to show that they had control. But Ben wasn't about to give them that. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of the bike staying just behind him, the light flashed in his side mirror. The rider pulled up alongside the truck, matching his speed, their eyes locking for a split second. Ben didn't recognize the biker at first, but the man's face was partially covered by a helmet, just enough for Ben to see the gleam of his eyes. The man gave him a quick nod, as if acknowledging him, but Ben didn't return it. Without a word, the biker sped up, pulling ahead of the truck. Ben watched as the man's silhouette grew smaller in his rearview mirror, the bike's engine cutting through the night. It was only when the biker disappeared over the crest of a hill that Ben allowed himself to relax. His grip on the steering wheel loosened slightly and his shoulders relaxed. The tension, though, still hung in the air, like a thread waiting to snap. It wasn't until the bike was gone that Ben allowed himself to exhale. He wasn't sure what had just happened, whether the man was simply a lone rider passing through, or if he had been following him for some other reason. Either way, Ben knew the score. He knew what it meant when someone pushed you, when they tried to provoke you into action. The road stretched out before him, endless and unmarked, but now there was a quiet in Ben's mind that hadn't been there before. He had dealt with it, whatever it had been. He had stood his ground, not because he had to, but because he knew what was right. The road might not ever stop challenging him, but he had learned over the years that the key to surviving it was understanding when to let the storm pass and when to let it burn itself out. The truck hummed steadily beneath him, the sound of the tires on the road blending with the quiet thrum of the engine. It was a sound that Ben knew well, a sound that told him everything was as it should be. The world outside might be chaotic, full of noise and distractions, but here, in this truck, he had found his rhythm, his peace. He didn't need to know who had been on that bike or why they had followed him. They were just part of the noise, part of the world he had already learned to tune out. The important thing, the only thing, was that he was still moving forward. And for now, that was enough.